The dog saved a soldier's life on the battlefield, but now he doesn't even recognize him. What unfolds next is both heartbreaking and incredible. The sun dipped low behind the Alaska mountains, casting streaks of orange and purple across the vast sky. Ethan Harper, a 36-year-old veteran, shuffled toward the town's modest animal shelter. Each step carried a weight he couldn't shed, a reminder of the battles fought and the wounds, both seen and unseen, that lingered. 2 years had passed since his military discharge, but the void left by war was as vast as the evening sky. He had no illusions of finding a quick fix, but his private doctor's gentle persistence echoed in his mind. Maybe a dog could help. Deep within, a quiet hope stirred, almost imperceptibly. Ethan hesitated at the shelter's gate, its rusty hinges groaning softly as he pushed it open. The compound smelled faintly of disinfectant, the air alive with scattered barking and whines. A worker nodded at him but didn't speak. Ethan began walking slowly through the narrow aisles, his gaze sweeping over the cages. Some dogs leaped against their enclosures, tails wagging furiously, desperate for attention. Others sat solemnly, their eyes pools of sorrow. Ethan paused briefly at each, but none stirred anything in him. The playful energy of some dogs felt foreign, even jarring. The somber stillness of others mirrored his own, yet failed to bridge the yawning gap in his chest. His hand brushed against a cage bar as he exhaled sharply. "This is pointless," he muttered under his breath, ready to turn back. As he did, a voice broke the silence. "Mr. Harper?" A shelter worker approached, her voice tentative. "We have a German shepherd in the back. He came in a few weeks ago. Maybe he's what you're looking for." Ethan froze. German shepherd. His throat tightened. He nodded stiffly, words escaping him, and followed her to a more secluded area. The cage at the end of the row looked no different from the others, but its occupant made Ethan's breath hitch. There, in the corner, lay a large German shepherd with black and tan fur, his frame powerful, yet bearing signs of neglect. A long scar traced down his back, unmistakable even in the dim light. Ethan didn't need a second glance. "Bob," he whispered, the name falling from his lips like a prayer. The dog's ears twitched, but he didn't move. Slowly, he raised his head, his amber eyes locking with Ethan's. Ethan waited, heart pounding, for the wag of a tail, a spark of recognition. But Bob's gaze was hollow, detached, as though Ethan were just another stranger. The silence between them was deafening. His hands clenched into fists as a wave of despair washed over him. The dog who had been his anchor during the chaos of war now looked at him without a flicker of familiarity. The shelter worker broke the silence. "He's been through a lot." Ethan swallowed hard, his gaze never leaving Bob. Memories surged unbidden, nights huddled in trenches, the sound of distant gunfire, and the unwavering presence of the dog who had saved his life more than once. Bob's loyalty had been absolute, his courage unmatched. And now, this shell of the dog he had known lay before him, scarred in ways Ethan understood all too well. "Can I—" Ethan's voice caught. "Can I go in?" The worker hesitated, then carefully opened the cage door. Bob watched but didn't react, his body tense but unmoving. Ethan stepped inside, crouching slowly to meet his old partner at eye level. "Hey, buddy," he said, his tone gentle but tinged with raw emotion. "It's me. It's Ethan." Bob didn't respond. Ethan extended a hand, keeping it steady though his chest felt as if it might shatter. Minutes passed like hours as the man and dog sat in silence, the gap between them seemingly insurmountable. But Ethan didn't move, didn't push. He simply stayed, his presence a quiet vow. Though the recognition wasn't there, Ethan saw something flicker briefly in Bob's eyes, an ember, faint but present. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Ethan stood slowly, his knees aching as he straightened. "I'm not giving up on you," he said, more to himself than to the dog. As he stepped out of the cage, he turned back one last time. Bob's gaze followed him, ever so slightly, a small but monumental step. "He doesn't remember me," Ethan whispered, his chest tightening painfully, a sharp ache spreading within. He took a step back, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. Yet as he stood there, unable to look away, a single thought anchored him. He couldn't walk away. Not now. Not from Bob. Bob, once the embodiment of vitality and determination, now seemed like a shadow of his former self. His amber eyes, once so vibrant, were clouded and distant. The scars on his hind leg and torn ear were visible reminders of battles fought and survived. But Ethan sensed there were deeper, invisible wounds. Wounds he knew all too well. The shelter worker said softly, her tone filled with empathy. He came from a small shelter in another state. He was surrendered by someone who just couldn't handle him anymore. She hesitated, glancing at Ethan. He has severe anxiety and struggles to trust people. Ethan nodded, his jaw tight as memories flooded in, grueling training sessions where trust was forged, perilous missions where Bob had saved his life, and lonely nights when Bob was his only anchor. He drew in a shaky breath. "He was my partner," Ethan said quietly. "My best friend." The worker opened the cage cautiously, the door creaking as it swung wide. Bob watched but didn't move, his posture guarded, his muscles taut. Ethan knelt slowly, extending his hand. "Hey, buddy, it's me, Ethan," he said, his voice trembling slightly. Bob tilted his head, his ears twitching, but his body remained still. His eyes flickered briefly, as though trying to process the voice, but he didn't move closer. Ethan swallowed hard, the lump in his throat growing. He knew this was going to take time, patience, and more strength than he'd needed in battle. "Would you like to spend some time with him?" the worker suggested gently. "We could take him to the play yard." Ethan nodded without hesitation. Outside, the play yard offered little reprieve. Bob sniffed the air, keeping his distance, his movements deliberate. Ethan stood quietly, watching every step, hoping for a sign, anything that would hint at the bond they once shared. But the sun sank lower, and nothing changed. Finally, Ethan spoke with quiet resolve. "I'm taking him home," he said firmly. "No matter how long it takes, I'll help him. We'll get through this." There was no uncertainty in his voice, only the echo of loyalty that had defined their past. Ethan knew this wasn't just about saving Bob. He needed saving too. The drive home was silent, marked only by the hum of the truck's engine. Bob lay on a blanket Ethan had spread in the back, staring out the window, avoiding eye contact. Ethan glanced in the rearview mirror, searching for some clue to Bob's thoughts. But the dog's demeanor remained inscrutable. The silence between them felt heavy, but Ethan understood. Both of them carried scars that made connection a fragile endeavor. Pulling into the driveway of his modest home on the outskirts of town, Ethan cut the engine and opened the door. "Come on, Bob," he called softly. The dog hesitated, his movements cautious, as if assessing his new surroundings for hidden threats. Eventually, he stepped down, his paws landing lightly on the ground. Ethan led him inside, opening the front door with care. "Welcome home," he said, his tone a mix of warmth and uncertainty. Bob paused in the entryway, his nose twitching as he sniffed the air, his body language guarded. In the living room, Ethan had prepared a corner for Bob, a new dog bed, bowls of food and water, and a few toys he'd picked up on the drive back. "This is your spot," Ethan said, gesturing to the setup. But Bob remained rooted in place, ignoring the offering. As Ethan moved to the kitchen to fix himself something to eat, his thoughts wandered. He remembered the Bob who once bounded toward him, eyes gleaming with loyalty and excitement. That dog, so full of life, now felt like a distant memory. Ethan sighed, the weight of the moment pressing heavier than ever. Bob had changed, damaged in ways that mirrored Ethan's own pain. But as he glanced back at Bob, still standing in the entryway, Ethan resolved once again. They were in this together, both wounded, both searching. And perhaps through each other, they could begin to heal. He glanced at Bob, still standing in the same spot, his gaze fixed on the far horizon. "I get it, buddy. I feel the same way. Lost," he muttered, more to himself than the dog. That night, Ethan left the bedroom door ajar, hoping Bob might feel comfortable enough to come closer. As the lights dimmed and the house fell silent, Ethan heard the soft padding of paws on the hardwood floor. Bob didn't climb into bed or even approach him, but instead lay down just outside the doorway, keeping his distance. Ethan smiled faintly in the dark. It was a small gesture, but to Ethan it felt like the start of something important. The following morning, Ethan awoke to the sound of light footsteps in the hallway. Peering over the edge of the bed, he saw Bob sitting near the door, ears alert, quietly watching him. For the first time in weeks, Ethan felt a flicker of hope. "Good morning, Bob," he said gently, stretching and forcing a smile. Bob, however, turned his head and padded slowly back to the far corner of the room. The rejection stung, but Ethan refused to give up. Determined to rebuild their bond, Ethan dedicated his day to small, deliberate gestures. He tossed a tennis ball across the room, but Bob barely glanced at it. He set a bowl of fresh food nearby, but the shepherd only approached once Ethan had left the room. Every effort seemed to fall flat, met by silence and distance. Yet Ethan knew it wasn't defiance, it was fear, distrust, and a deep, unspoken pain that mirrored his own. That afternoon, Ethan decided to try something different. He rummaged through an old storage box in the closet and pulled out his worn military vest. The faded fabric still carried the sense of their shared past, sand, sweat, and the tension of the battlefield. Slipping it on, he inhaled deeply, letting the memories wash over him. "Let's see if this rings a bell, boy," he said, stepping out into the backyard. Bob, lounging near the porch, perked up slightly at the sight of the vest. His head tilted ever so slightly, curiosity sparking in his eyes. Encouraged, Ethan gently laid the vest on the ground and backed away, giving Bob space to investigate. The German shepherd approached cautiously, his nose twitching as he sniffed the familiar material. For a fleeting moment, Ethan thought he saw recognition in Bob's eyes. But just as quickly, the dog retreated, his tail tucked low as he moved back to the shadows. Ethan let out a long sigh, the flicker of hope dimming once again. Later that evening, Ethan sat on the porch, the cool night air brushing against his skin. From his chair, he watched Bob stretched out in the yard, his gaze fixed on the sky. "I'm not giving up on you," Ethan said aloud, his voice firm yet tender. "You didn't give up on me, not when I needed you most, and I won't let you down now." He knew he was asking a lot, but he also believed that their bond, though buried under layers of pain, could still be unearthed. As the night grew colder, Ethan retreated inside, leaving the back door open. Hours later, the faint sound of scratching on the floor woke him. In the dim glow of the moonlight, he saw Bob lying at the foot of the bed, his eyes heavy with sleep. Ethan didn't speak. He simply smiled. The distance between them was shrinking, small, almost imperceptible, but it was progress. In the days that followed, little moments began to surface, like cracks in a thick wall of distrust. One crisp Monday morning, as Ethan chopped wood in the yard, he noticed Bob watching him from a distance. The dog's tail remained low, but there was a quiet curiosity in his gaze. Wiping the sweat from his brow, Ethan paused and called out, "Want to help, boy?" Bob didn't move closer, but he didn't look away either. Later that same day, during a quiet stroll around the yard, Ethan picked up a stick and casually tossed it a few feet ahead. He didn't expect much. To his surprise, Bob hesitated, then took a tentative step toward the stick before retreating to his spot. Ethan chuckled softly. "Ah, you remember, don't you? You're just playing hard to get." By Tuesday, Ethan decided it was time for a new step. He retrieved Bob's old ID tag, cleaned off the tarnish, and attached it to a fresh collar. "All right, pal," Ethan said, securing the leash with care. "Let's go for a walk." He didn't know how far they'd go, but he was certain of one thing. They were moving forward, together. Bob hesitated as Ethan unlatched the gate, sorty wary, and his eyes scanning the yard as though the world outside was a threat waiting to pounce. Ethan gave a gentle tug on the leash, coaxing him to step forward. Slowly, Bob relented, but his body remained rigid, his ears twitching at every faint sound. His nose stayed to the ground, sniffing intently, as though the slightest whiff of danger might appear. Ethan noticed the tension and spoke softly, his voice steady. "It's all right, boy. There's no need to worry. You're safe now." He knew the words likely held no meaning for Bob, but Ethan hoped the calming tone might plant a seed of trust. As they strolled back toward the house, something surprising happened. Ethan was reaching to remove Bob's leash when the dog hesitated, then stepped closer and sniffed his hand. Ethan froze, his heart thudding. "That's it, Bob," he whispered, keeping his movements slow and unthreatening. He let the dog explore his scent for a moment, resisting the urge to reach out. When Bob finally backed away, Ethan felt a flicker of hope. It wasn't much, but it was a start, proof that the wall between them might be starting to crumble. That evening, while Ethan prepared dinner, Bob settled on the rug near the kitchen. It wasn't quite an invitation to bond, but the proximity felt like a small victory. Ethan glanced over his shoulder and smiled faintly. "Looks like we're figuring each other out, huh?" he murmured. Bob didn't react, but his gaze held less of the guarded distance that had defined him since the reunion. For Ethan, it was a tiny step toward the connection they'd once shared, a glimmer of recognition. Have you ever rebuilt trust with an animal after hard times? Maybe you found healing in those quiet, shared moments. Share your stories with us in the comments. We'd love to hear how animals have touched your life. The next morning dawned grey and misty, the fog draping the yard like a heavy blanket. Ethan rose early as usual, but found Bob already awake. The German Shepherd sat by the window, staring out at the blurry shapes beyond the glass. He looked lost in thought, his ears drooping slightly. Ethan approached slowly, aware that every interaction with Bob required patience and care. "Thinking about something, buddy?" Ethan asked softly, his voice barely above a whisper. He knew there'd be no answer, but the question hung in the air like an unspoken bridge between them. Later, after breakfast, Ethan decided it was time to try something different. From the back of a dusty closet, he pulled out a wooden box that had remained untouched for years. Inside were keepsakes from his time in the service, medals, photographs, and faded letters. Among them, tucked into a corner, was an old rubber ball, a toy Bob had adored during their brief moments of rest in the field. Ethan held the ball in his hands, the worn surface bringing back a flood of memories. The sound of Bob's playful bark echoed in his mind, a reminder of simpler moments amidst chaos. He glanced toward the living room where Bob was lying, his eyes half closed but his ears twitching. Ethan turned the ball over in his hands, a faint smile playing on his lips. Perhaps this small piece of their shared past could be a step toward their future. Then Ethan headed to the yard, where Bob was resting, and gently tossed the ball near the dog. Bob's body stiffened as his eyes locked on the object. He sniffed the air, almost as though he detected a scent that stirred something deep in his memory. For a moment, it seemed like he might ignore the ball entirely, but then, hesitantly, he moved closer. He lowered his head to sniff the ball, pausing as though weighing its familiarity, then stepped back again. Ethan stood silently, watching the internal battle unfold in Bob's mind. "You remember this, don't you?" Ethan asked, his voice tinged with quiet hope. That day, there was a subtle shift. During lunch, Bob stayed closer to Ethan, following him with a newfound attentiveness. For the first time, he accepted food directly from Ethan's hand. Ethan's heart swelled, though he kept his emotions tempered. He didn't want to overwhelm Bob or break the delicate thread of trust forming between them. The German shepherd ate cautiously, his eyes locked onto Ethan's, as if trying to decide whether he could believe in him again. Later, Ethan sat on the porch with the ball in hand, rolling it absent-mindedly between his fingers. "Remember the night you brought this to me because you couldn't sleep?" he said, a faint smile playing on his lips. The memory was bittersweet, Bob's stubborn insistence on playing during those long, tense nights. "You were always so persistent. Still are, I guess." Ethan tossed the ball gently across the yard, not expecting much. To his surprise, Bob perked up his ears, his eyes following the ball's arc. While he didn't chase it, it was a small sign, a flicker of interest. That night, as Bob settled near Ethan's bed, the veteran felt something shift again. The space between them wasn't just physical anymore. It felt like an invisible wall of pain was beginning to crack. Though both were still burdened by their own wounds, they were starting to share the weight of it. Before switching off the light, Ethan looked at Bob and said softly, "We're getting there, partner. We're getting there." The next morning, sunlight spilled across the backyard, casting a warm glow as Ethan prepared for a new approach with Bob. He decided to try an old training routine from their military days, hoping to unlock a buried memory. With a whistle hanging around his neck and a rope in hand, Ethan felt a mix of anticipation and caution. "We'll take it easy today, buddy," he murmured as they walked to the center of the yard. Bob trailed behind at a safe distance, his eyes fixed on Ethan's every move. Ethan blew the whistle softly and issued a simple command. "Sit." For a moment, Bob stood still, his body tense. But then, slowly and deliberately, he lowered himself into a sitting position. "Good boy," Ethan said, his voice tinged with both surprise and pride. Encouraged, Ethan picked up the rubber ball and tossed it a short distance away. "Fetch, Bob," he called, his tone gentle yet firm, trying to channel the energy of their past training sessions. Bob hesitated, his gaze shifting between the ball and Ethan. Time seemed to stretch as he contemplated his next move. Finally, he took a tentative step toward the ball, paused, and glanced back at Ethan before picking it up with his mouth. A shiver ran through Ethan as he watched Bob return with the ball. When the dog dropped it at Ethan's feet and looked up at him, something extraordinary happened. Bob's gaze held a spark of recognition, faint but undeniable. It was as though he was beginning to remember who Ethan had been to him and what they had shared. Ethan felt his throat tighten as his emotions welled up. Still, he kept his composure, not wanting to overwhelm Bob with the depth of his feelings. Instead, he knelt down, took the ball, and gently patted Bob on the side. "Good job, buddy," he said, his voice steady but warm. In that moment, Ethan knew the journey ahead would still be long, but he also knew they were finally moving forward, together. That day marked a subtle but powerful shift. Bob, who had been so distant, began staying closer to Ethan. Throughout the afternoon, he trailed Ethan as he moved around the house, even tolerating gentle touches that he would have shied away from before. When Ethan settled on the couch, Bob stretched out on the floor beside him, something he'd never done until now. It wasn't just the familiar sights or smells. It felt deeper, as if a piece of the wall between them was beginning to crumble. That evening, while Ethan was sorting through some old belongings, he stumbled upon a photograph tucked in a weathered envelope. It was a picture of him and Bob, taken on the day they'd completed one of their toughest missions. Their faces, tired and smudged with dirt, held the unmistakable glow of triumph. Ethan placed the photo on the nightstand, studying it for a moment before turning it toward Bob. "Hey, look at this, buddy," Ethan said, his voice soft with nostalgia. "We were quite the team, weren't we?" Bob's eyes lingered on the photo for a moment before he lay down beside Ethan, inching closer than he had ever dared since arriving at the house. As night fell, a rumble of thunder rolled across the sky, followed by the rhythmic patter of rain on the roof. Ethan glanced out the window and saw Bob standing near the porch door, his nose lifted toward the breeze. The dog seemed mesmerized, his silhouette still as the sky lit up briefly with flashes of lightning. With a steaming mug of coffee in hand, Ethan approached slowly, leaning against the doorframe. "You've always loved storms, haven't you?" Ethan said softly, more to himself than to Bob. The German shepherd turned his head slightly, his eyes meeting Ethan's. This time, something in his gaze was different. It wasn't the cold indifference that had been there before. There was hesitation, yes, but also a flicker of curiosity, a tentative sign that Bob was beginning to thaw. Ethan's chest tightened with cautious hope. He knew progress wouldn't come all at once, but these fleeting moments gave him the encouragement to keep trying. Deciding to take a small step forward, he opened the cabinet where he kept his old military gear. Among the neatly packed items was the whistle he'd used during missions. Ethan held it in his hand, turning it over thoughtfully. He wasn't sure if this was the right move. It might stir memories Bob wasn't ready to face, but it was worth a try. Stepping out onto the porch, Ethan raised the whistle to his lips and blew 2 short, sharp notes, the same signal he'd used to call Bob during missions. The reaction was immediate. Bob's ears perked up, and he snapped his head toward Ethan, his entire body tense with alertness. For a fleeting second, Ethan thought Bob might rush to his side, as he had done so many times before. Instead, the dog hesitated, taking a single, tentative step forward before stopping, his eyes clouded with uncertainty. The spark that had briefly lit his eyes faded, replaced by a shadow of doubt. Bob lowered his head, his posture heavy with an inner conflict Ethan could only guess at. Ethan let out a long breath, slipping the whistle back into his pocket. He crouched down to Bob's level and spoke in a steady, reassuring tone. "It's okay, pal. We'll take this one step at a time. No rush." Later, as the rain intensified, Ethan prepared a dry blanket and set it near the porch for Bob, along with a fresh bowl of water. Watching the dog settle down, Ethan felt a quiet determination take root. Bob wasn't just a dog, he was a partner, a survivor. And though their journey back to each other wouldn't be easy, Ethan resolved to see it through. Some bonds, no matter how battered, were worth the fight. He placed the items gently in the corner of the room and decided not to force anything this time. Instead, he lowered himself to the floor near the dog, careful to keep his distance. Simply being present was his way of silently telling Bob he wasn't alone anymore. Slowly, Bob's rigid posture softened. The dog eased onto the rug, stealing cautious glances in Ethan's direction. As the night deepened, Bob surprised him. The German shepherd slowly rose, his heavy breathing breaking the room's stillness as he edged closer. He stopped a mere few inches from Ethan, who remained motionless, respecting Bob's space. The dog sniffed the air around Ethan, hesitating as if weighing the enormity of what he was about to do. Then, with a tentative motion, Bob nudged Ethan's hand with his nose. The contact was fleeting, but it sent a surge of emotion through Ethan's chest. "You're still in there, buddy," he whispered, his voice thick with feeling. Ethan didn't reach out or move, knowing even the slightest reaction could shatter the fragile moment. When Bob finally pulled back, Ethan exhaled, his relief mingling with cautious optimism. It was a small gesture, but to Ethan it felt monumental, a glimmer of the bond they once shared. Later that night, as the storm howled outside, Ethan spotted Bob lying at the foot of his bed. Though still somewhat wary, the dog seemed less withdrawn. For Ethan, that subtle change was enough. Despite everything, their connection wasn't lost. It was waiting, ready to be rebuilt. By morning, sunlight poured through the windows, painting the yard in warm gold. Ethan, coffee mug in hand, stood on the porch, watching Bob wander across the damp grass. There was something different about the way Bob moved. His steps seemed less burdened, his demeanor less guarded. For fleeting moments, Ethan caught glimpses of the determined partner he once knew. Ethan reached for the old whistle he hadn't used in years, its weight familiar in his hand. He hesitated, then gave 2 short bursts, the same signal he'd used so many times before. Bob's head snapped up immediately, his ears perked and his body alert. Ethan stayed calm, careful not to rush or let his anticipation show. "Come on, boy," he murmured, his tone steady and encouraging. To Ethan's amazement, Bob began to move toward him, each step more confident than the last. The German shepherd's eyes were fixed on the whistle, as if piecing together something deeply buried in his memory. Ethan felt a lump rise in his throat as Bob finally stopped in front of him, sniffing the air cautiously. Moving deliberately, Ethan reached for the rubber ball he'd used the night before. He held it up briefly before tossing it gently to the side. Bob hesitated, standing still for a moment. But then something shifted. With an unexpected burst of energy, Bob bolted after the ball, returning it and dropping it at Ethan's feet. Ethan froze, his eyes welling with tears. That simple act, small to anyone else, was monumental to him. "That's my boy," Ethan said, his voice cracking. He picked up the ball and threw it again, this time watching Bob sprint faster, his tail wagging faintly as he came back. Each throw seemed to chip away at the invisible wall surrounding Bob, revealing glimpses of the dog Ethan remembered. It felt almost magical, as though the patience and quiet persistence of the past few days had finally borne fruit. Every step Bob took felt like a victory, not just for him, but for Ethan too. That evening, for the first time since Bob had come home, the dog climbed onto the couch beside Ethan, his head resting near the veteran's leg. Ethan didn't speak or move, choosing instead to let the moment unfold naturally. The silence between them was profound, a quiet acknowledgement of trust beginning to heal. As Ethan gently stroked Bob's head, he felt a deep sense of resolve. No matter how long the road ahead might be, he would never give up on his loyal companion, the friend who had once saved his life. The morning sun streamed through the blinds, painting the room in soft golden light. Ethan stood silently near the door, holding Bob's leash in one hand and a worn military vest in the other. His fingers brushed over the fabric, its patches and scratches bearing the weight of memories shared. "Today's the big day, buddy," he said, his voice steady but edged with hope. This wasn't just a trip to the park, it was a test, a quiet reckoning to see how far they had come since their fractured reunion. Bob, now calmer than Ethan could have hoped, watched him closely. His amber eyes held something new, not quite the fire of old, but a flicker of trust. Ethan clipped the leash to Bob's collar and led him out to the truck. The ride to the park felt different. Bob sat in the back seat, his head tilted slightly out the open window, letting the breeze ruffle his fur. Ethan glanced at him through the rearview mirror, his chest tightening with pride. "Just like the old days, huh?" he murmured, though he didn't expect an answer. For weeks, he had fought to bring Bob back to this moment. Now, the weight of their shared journey pressed against him, bittersweet but resolute. At the park, Ethan paused before opening the truck door. He looked at Bob, his hand resting on the leash. "Here we go," he said softly. The German shepherd stepped out, his movements sure but measured, his nose twitching as he took in the familiar scents. Ethan led him to a quiet clearing, their old haunt. The space was unchanged, a patch of soft grass bordered by tall oaks, and the distant sound of a trickling creek. Ethan unclipped the leash and pulled a faded rubber ball from his pocket. He held it up, letting Bob see it before tossing it into the open field. For a brief moment, Bob stood motionless, scanning his surroundings. But then, with a burst of energy, he bolted after the ball, his legs propelling him forward with a grace Ethan hadn't seen in years. When Bob returned, dropping the ball at Ethan's feet, something inside Ethan shifted. For hours, they played as if time had folded in on itself, erasing the scars of the past. Ethan watched Bob with quiet amazement. The dog he had once known so intimately was still there, emerging piece by piece. Yet Ethan also understood that neither of them would ever be the same. The war had changed them, reshaped their edges. But in this new space, they were finding something different, something just as profound. As the sun began its descent, casting long shadows across the grass, Ethan sat on a park bench, exhaustion mingling with peace. Bob padded over, settling beside him, and after a moment rested his head on Ethan's lap. Ethan ran his hand gently over Bob's fur, his voice low as he whispered, "I told you I wouldn't give up on you." The weight of those words lingered in the air. It wasn't just a promise to Bob, it was a promise to himself. The quiet stretched between them, comfortable and full. Ethan's gaze drifted to the horizon, where the sky burned in hues of orange and purple. He hadn't felt this kind of peace in years. The turmoil that had chased him home from the battlefield seemed, at least for now, to have eased. The drive home was silent, but comforting. Ethan glanced at Bob, who lay curled in the back seat, his body relaxed in a way that had been unthinkable just weeks ago. In the stillness, Ethan reflected on how far they had come. Bob wasn't just a dog. He was a survivor, a symbol of resilience and the power of love to heal. That night, Bob lay beside Ethan on the couch, his presence a steady reassurance. Ethan rested his hand on the dog's head, his heart full yet quiet. They had endured so much, pain, loss, the ache of separation, but now they had found each other again. Whatever the future held, Ethan knew one thing. They would face it together. Bob, with his courage and loyalty, had taught Ethan that healing wasn't about returning to who they once were. It was about discovering who they could become, side by side. Thank you for joining us on this heartfelt journey of Ethan and Bob, a story of resilience, love, and the healing power of connection. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to give it a like and share it with someone who might need a little inspiration today. And if you're new here, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss more uplifting stories like this one. Together, we're building a community that celebrates the bonds that truly matter. Thank you for being part of this, and we'll see you next time with another story that reminds us of the strength within us all. Take care and see you soon.